Hi biologists, let's start by looking at the learning objectives for this lesson. At the end of this section, and following the biology syllabus, take note that this material is for the higher level biology only. You should be able to describe the work of Gregor Mendel leading to the expression of his findings in 2 laws. You should also be able to state and explain the Law of Independent Assortment. What does this actually mean? What are we trying to understand? Well, you have to be able to describe the work of Gregor Mendel and how it led to his 2 laws of genetics. You have to be able to state and explain one of these laws, the Law of Independent Assortment. Before we start, we need to be clear about a few ideas or concepts. One concept that causes confusion is the difference between characteristics and contrasting traits. Genetic characteristics are features or traits that you inherit from your parents. This is the first source of confusion because the word traits is used here to mean characteristics that you inherit. Human characteristics are eye colour and blood type. Pea plant characteristics are pea colour, pea shape, pea plant height, flower colour. We need to be clear on what characteristics are. What are contrasting traits? Well, each characteristic has 2 different forms. Here, for example, if we are talking about pea colour, there are 2 different forms. There are yellow peas and there are green peas. When the forms are opposite to each other, they're called contrasting traits. Contrasting traits for eye colour are brown and blue. Contrasting traits for pea plant height are tall and small, or as we've said, for pea colour, yellow and green. There are 7 pea plant characteristics. We will be interested in the first 4. The first characteristic is plant height with the contrasting traits of tall and small. Pea colour, contrasting traits yellow and green. The other characteristic is flower colour, contrasting traits purple and white. And pea shape, the contrasting traits being round and wrinkled. The other 3 characteristics are the characteristic of pod colour, contrasting traits green and yellow, pod shape, contrasting traits inflated or constricted, meaning flat, flower position, contrasting traits being axial, the flower on the side of the shoot, or terminal, the flower at the end of the shoot. Also, we must realise that Gregor Mendel, often referred to as the father of genetics because he carried out the first experiments, carried out his experiments on pea plants. He focused on the 7 different characteristics. Don't forget, each characteristic had 2 contrasting traits. He studied firstly how one characteristic, and then went on to study how 2 characteristics at the same time were inherited, following the inheritance down through 2 generations. Why did he work with pea plants? Well, pea plants are easy to grow. They can be grown in large numbers. They have short life cycles, so you can see your results quickly. They can be self-pollinated, fertilized with their own pollen, and there are large numbers of offspring. Let's look at Mendel's Dihybrid Crosses. Here we are studying the inheritance of 2 characteristics at the same time. We have to be able to describe Mendel's work. Well, first of all, he crossed a pure breeding tall pea plant. Pure breeding means that in the family tree of this pea plant, there was never any sign of any plant that was small. Generation after generation, these tall pea plants only bred tall pea plants. Mendel knew this, because he bred all these pea plants himself. So he crossed a pure breeding tall pea plant which would produce yellow seeds with a pure breeding small pea plant which would produce green seeds. So looking here, we have two characteristics. We have the characteristic of height with the contrasting trait of tall and small, and we have the characteristic of seed colour or peed colour with the two contrasting traits, yellow and green. We must be able to see that. All the F1 generation, all the offspring, the first generation, your parents are the first generation belonging to your grandparents. So the first generation here were all tall and made yellow seeds. He let this F1 generation self-fertilize or self-pollinate, in other words, fertilize themselves with their own pollen. Then he got the F2 generation or the second generation. You would be the second generation to your grandparents. And in the second generation, he got 4 different types of plants. He got tall and yellow ones, which we saw before, tall and green ones, or green-seeded ones, a new combination. Small pea plants, which produced yellow seeds, and small pea plants, which produced green seeds that we saw before, in a ratio of 9:3:3:1. This means if he had 160 plants in the F2 generation, then approximately 90 of them would have been tall and yellow, approximately 30 of them would be tall and green, approximately 30 would be small and yellow, and approximately 10 of them would be small and green. From these results he deduced or came up with his second law. We have to know this definition, word perfect, off by heart. Mendel's second law of independent assortment. Members of one pair of factors separate independently of members of another pair of factors at gamete formation. What does this mean? How are we to understand this? Well, to understand the meaning of this, we first of all have to remember Mendel's first law of segregation, which we've already covered. Also recall the fact that segregation means to separate. So in the past we learned that every characteristic, perhaps the characteristic of height, is governed by a pair of factors. This is what Mendel discovered. These factors, which we now know to have been chromosomes or genes, separate during gamete formation, and each gamete will only get one factor from the pair. This time round he saw that, in addition to the law of segregation, that the inheritance of height had no influence over the inheritance of seed colour, that the characteristics were inherited independently of one another. And so he deduced his law, that each pair of factors separate freely, independently, and without influence from any other pair of factors. Now Mendel came up with his findings and deduced his 2 laws without knowing of the existence of chromosomes or genes. But he died without his work being recognized. He was so far ahead of his time. Now that we have reached the end of our lesson, are you able to describe the work of Gregor Mendel leading to the expression of his findings in 2 laws? Are you able to state and explain the law of independent assortment?